The 9/11 operation was a military operation disguised as a terror operation. It involved a very, very extensive, very deep, very sophisticated infiltration of the American defense, American military, American political establishment at all levels. When you understand that, it's far, far beyond the ability of anything like Osama bin Laden. We've never seen anything like this before in history. 9/11 was carried out on deception. It's all like a stage magician's trick.
Hey friends, before we get started with journalist Christopher Bollyn, I want to invite each and every one of you to visit our sponsor, naturalhempoil.com. Guys, these products are excellent. Live well, recover fast with natural hemp oil. And naturalhempoil.com's CBD oil is triple lab tested, non-GMO, and contains no herbicides. And I can tell you from personal experience, these products can make a big impact. Cannabis oil, CBD, is the non-psychoactive part of the cannabis plant. And I personally would recommend the drops. Try a 60-day supply starting at $89.99 and begin promoting your health, optimizing recovery, and feel better with CBD oil, free shipping on orders over $100. Visit naturalhempoil.com. I'll provide a link below this video. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome world-renowned 9/11 researcher, author, and journalist Christopher Bollyn to the program. I'm a big fan of Christopher's work. You're going to want to sit back, buckle up, and listen closely because we're going to be talking about all things 9/11 and the truth about what really happened that day. It's my great pleasure to welcome Christopher, and I want to give a shout out to our mutual friend Adam Green at No More News, who was kind enough to get Christopher and I in touch with each other for this interview. Christopher, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Sean.
And guys, I just want to invite everybody to visit Bollyn.com, Christopher's website, and support this great researcher, probably the premier researcher in the area of 9/11, by buying his two-book set, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, and The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East, both books for $50. And you'll be doing Mr. Bollyn a great service, as well as yourself, by stocking your library with some of the best 9/11 material out there.
Well, no, there's one other book. The Solving 9/11 set of books is two books. The Deception That Changed the World is the analysis in a concise form. The larger book, Solving 9/11, the original articles, contains all my articles that I wrote over the first 11 years of research from 2001 to 2012. And so for the $50 donation, they get both those books plus the War on Terror book.
Well, Christopher, let me ask you this. As a journalist who wasn't necessarily entrenched in the world of conspiracy theories, you, like me and so many others, had a lot of questions about what really happened on 9/11, because right out of the gate, the official story wasn't adding up, particularly with the collapse of World Trade Center 7 at 5:25 in the afternoon, which was largely ignored by the mainstream media. What compelled you, what drove you to dive into this area, 9/11 research?
Yeah, well, it did fall into my domain, actually, because I was a investigative journalist. I'd been working with a newspaper called The Spotlight in Washington, D.C. And, I did things like covered Bilderberg conferences, and I had written about the shooting down of TWA Flight 800. Most notably, I'd been to the final hearings of the National NTSB, the Safety Board, where they clearly were demonstrating that there was a cover-up about what happened to Flight 800. And that was about 1 year before 9/11 happened. And then 9/11 happened. And I had worked on other government cover-ups of mass atrocities and massacres and things like that. So this 9/11, at first, I was in New York City passing through early in the morning with my family. And we couldn't go to Washington. We came back, drove across the middle of the country back to Chicago. And all this stuff was going on, and from the very beginning, it became clear that there were certain aspects of the atrocity that were going to be discussed in the very beginning, were talked about in the very beginning, and then were dropped, completely dropped, like the evidence of explosions in the World Trade Center, the involvement of these dancing Israelis, the 5 dancing Israelis in New Jersey. Certain aspects were suddenly on day 2 completely scrubbed from the official story, narrative, discussion in the media. And that's where I began my research, because when you find certain important elements of a crime or something like 9/11 that are clearly being avoided by the media, that's where you start looking, because there's something there that they don't want the public to know. And that's where I started.
Yeah, 100% right. And researchers have figured that out. Independent investigative journalists have figured that out with all these false flags since. There's always a lot of truth that spills out on day one. The same is true with the Oklahoma City bombing, as you well know. The same is true with the 7/7 bombings in London, in which it was revealed that on that very day they were running an operation that exactly mirrored the explosions as they happened in the exact same places. And Peter Powers, I think, admitted that.
Today we were running an exercise for a company, bearing in mind I'm now in the private sector, and we sat everybody down in the city, 1,000 people involved in the whole organisation, but the crisis team, and the most peculiar thing was we based our scenario on the simultaneous attacks on the Underground and mainline station. So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real.
And it's just stunning. You're right. On day one, that's when you've got to really pay attention, because the narrative changes. And in support of what you're saying, I want to play this clip. This is journalist Jack Kelly being interviewed by USA Today. And let's listen to the theory on the morning of 9/11 as all of this was unfolding. Listen to this.
Joining me is Jack Kelly. Now, he is a foreign correspondent, war correspondent, and just came back from Israel. He has some information about these attacks. Jack, what can you tell us happened first in New York?
Apparently what appears to happen was that at the same time two planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is still unconfirmed, but that is what the FBI is going on at this point.
All right, I'll pause it there. Did you notice a couple things there? He's a foreign correspondent who just returned from Israel, and they were watching this as it all unfolded, Christopher, from Arlington, Virginia, home to the CIA. How convenient. Just a coincidence, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that paper is also based there. USA Today, I think he wrote for it, didn't he?
She did. The reporter questioning him
Yeah.
has a USA Today microphone. It's a USA Today icon here in the lower right hand of the video.
Yeah, they're based in Arlington.
Okay. So let me play you, if you don't mind, let me play you a follow-up. This is later on perhaps in the day, but exact same reporter, exact same guy, Jack Kelly. By the way, Jack Kelly, doesn't that just sound like Jack Ryan, the fictional superhero CIA character? But all right, so here's Jack Kelly. Now the theories of what has unfolded here in real time on 9/11. Boy, does this guy have the answers. Listen to this.
Yes, that's right, Gordon and Gavir. We're on the 22nd floor of 1000 Wilson Boulevard in Arlington, Virginia, and we have watched as the jet crashed into the Pentagon. We were here. Jack Kelly, of course, came into work. He's our foreign correspondent for USA Today, and you're right, was there in Israel. Jack, what can you tell us? What are intelligence sources saying? Is this Osama bin Laden?
At this point, all fingers appear to be pointing towards him. He is the only person with the sophistication and the wealth to carry out something like this.
Is anyone going on the record saying this?
No, nobody at this point will go on the record, but every single law enforcement official is saying it's either state-sponsored or it's Osama bin Laden, and appears to be Osama bin Laden.
I'll pause it there. I guess I jumped the gun. It was the second clip in which they reveal they were watching the plane that hit the Pentagon from the 22nd floor in that building in Arlington, Virginia. But yeah, he said law enforcement believes it was likely state-sponsored or all carried out by Osama bin Laden. Now we can talk about the fact that it was state-sponsored, and it included a couple important states.
Right. That's a very interesting thing what he said there, that it's the sophistication and the amount of wealth necessary to carry out such a plot like 9/11.
Is this Osama bin Laden?
At this point, all fingers appear to be pointing towards him. He is the only person with the sophistication and the wealth to carry out something like this.
First of all, we have to be very clear. September 11th, the 9/11 operation was a military operation disguised as a terror operation. Not all terror attacks are sophisticated like 9/11 was. 9/11 was the most sophisticated terror attack in history, and it involved a very, very extensive, very deep, very sophisticated infiltration of the American defense, American military, American political establishment at all levels. And so, when you understand that, it's far, far beyond the ability of anything like Osama bin Laden. This is something that is so sophisticated the former counterterrorism expert at the State Department, he said that it was something so sophisticated that it reminded him of a Soviet intelligence operation. He said, we've never seen anything like this before in history. And it's not Soviet. It wasn't the Soviet operation. My analysis shows that the Israeli military intelligence is very much involved in 9/11, and that they were the alpha dog. And anybody else, like the insiders, inside job people, are insiders in the government who are dual nationals or Israel firsters. People like Michael Chertoff. I've just been reading the book of Michael Rupert, Crossing the Rubicon, which was written in 2004. I find it interesting that he and I never saw eye to eye on this, but actually he does suspect Israel throughout the book. But he's a detective. He should understand that 9/11 was a huge crime that needed to be investigated. He never discusses once Michael Chertoff, the person who was supposed to investigate 9/11, who should have prosecuted 9/11, the assistant attorney general under John Ashcroft, in charge of the criminal division of the Department of Justice. And Michael Chertoff is an Israeli national whose mother was a Mossad agent. This is the man who was supposed to investigate 9/11 and didn't. This is the person who allowed all the critical evidence from the crime scene in New York and Washington to be destroyed.
Folks, you can't make this stuff up, and it was Philip Zelikow who then was placed at the head of the 9/11 Commission, which, by the way, the administration did not want. They did not want an investigation done into this, but it was the family members, the women that lost their husbands, so many of them, that demanded an investigation. And when Bush couldn't get Kissinger to chair it, they put in Philip Zelikow, who I think is also a Zionist and a dual citizen of Israel.
Yeah, but the important thing is that the commission, the 9/11 Commission, of course, was politically appointed, and Philip Zelikow was the executive director. He was the capo di tutti. He was the boss of the whole thing, who ran the whole thing. He cherry-picked information. He himself actually testified, like his testimony about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, is in the report. So the executive director testifies to his own commission. I mean, this is more like a Soviet commission in the old days it's a completely fraudulent investigation. 9/11 was a crime of mass murder. Something like 3,000 people were killed in broad daylight, 2,600 of them in the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center towers were a crime scene of mass murder. First and foremost, the evidence from that crime scene should have been preserved and analyzed like any other crime scene. It was not. It was destroyed. And the destruction went on 24/7, beginning from day one. This is criminal. In and of itself, this is a crime, which means that people like John Ashcroft and Michael Chertoff and George Bush should be held accountable for destruction of evidence.
Oh, absolutely. And guys, those of you that follow the Pedogate and Pizzagate investigations will probably not find this surprising. It's just another coincidence. But all of that evidence that was taken from 9/11 Ground Zero, including the remains of so many loved ones, was taken to a place called Fresh Kills Landfill, I believe in New Jersey. You just can't make that up. It's the most insensitive. It just leaves me dumbfounded. Okay, so let's just rewind back to this idea that the Mossad and Israel played a role. I want to quote this from Socrates. It certainly applies to you. He is a man of courage who does not run away, but remains at his post and fights against the enemy. I included that quote in my video that I produced on April 11th, 2010. It's called You Can't Handle the 9/11 Truth. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts explains, and at the end of the video, I have this soundbite from Dr. Alan Sabrowski, former director of studies at the U.S. Army War College, and he says this about 9/11.
What we need to stand up and say is not only did they attack the USS Liberty, they did 9/11. They did it. That it is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation, period.
All right, I'll pause it there. The reason I wanted to play that is because when I first heard him say that, and I would love to give credit to the person who interviewed him, his name escapes me, but it really made me believe all the truth was going to spill out. I thought it was all going to come out, but they've covered it up because they have a willing, complicit media.
Yes. Well, the thing is that the media is part of the whole criminal network that's running our country and the Western European societies. That's the question: is the media controlling the government, or which is subservient to the other. And the media is owned in the United States today by about 6 companies, plus the New York Times. And these companies are big corporations, and they have created this edifice of lies, the 9/11, saga, the story, the narrative we've been given from day one. That, like you saw that Jack Kelly telling us that it was Osama bin Laden. That's what they all said. Ehud Barak was in London speaking to the BBC World Television on 9/11 after the buildings fell, saying that the world will never be the same. This is Osama bin Laden. We know where he is. And now is the time to begin a concrete operational war against terrorism. So 9/11 was done in order to kickstart the war on terror. And this has been pushed by the media all across the mainstream media since day one. Well, who's giving them their orders? I mean, why don't they investigate any of the unanswered questions? Why don't they examine the molten metal that was found in the dust and at the base of the World Trade Center? Why do they avoid all these things? Because they are told to. Their owners tell them to. Well, their owners don't change over the period of years, whereas our political leadership has changed. We've gone from Republican to Democrat, back to Republican, and the story it remains the same. We're still fighting this war on terror. The war that has come out of 9/11, the wars that have come out of 9/11, the so-called war on terror, is the longest war in American history and the most expensive war in American history. Well, who benefits from the huge expense of the war? Well, the banksters, Rothschilds, and the people who finance the American government, who buy America's debt. What does that mean for us? It means that we're becoming enslaved. We're enslaved to the lie. We're enslaved to the lie of 9/11, and we become physically and spiritually enslaved to those people who lie to us.
Yeah, that's right. And I want to give equal credit to the CIA and to the neocons for being involved in what happened on 9/11. This wasn't purely a Mossad operation. And I don't know if you've ever seen this video. It's one of my favorites about 9/11. It's from Alien Scientist. It was released on October 31st, 2012. It's titled 9/11 Conspiracy Solved, Names, Connections, and Details Exposed. And what it makes you realize in this 43-minute microdocumentary, it makes you realize that 9/11 wasn't just about getting us into illegal wars of aggression. It wasn't just about the Greater Israel Project. It wasn't just about unconstitutional wars without end, which the neocons called for. They wanted a new Pearl Harbor, of course, right? They wrote about that before 9/11. But it was also about covering up major financial crimes, including $240 billion in Treasury fraud. Let me just play this clip. This is the beginning of his video from Alien Scientist, Christopher. And you jump in at any point, because I'll probably play the first minute or two, and then we have other things to discuss about the companies that were in buildings 1 and 2 and that were conveniently taken out when those planes hit. So listen to this.
In September 1991, shortly after the end of the Cold War, a cabal of elite bankers and intelligence spooks led by George H.W. Bush financed a $240 billion covert operations war chest through the purchase of 10-year securities that, as it happened, were scheduled to come due on September 12, 2001. Project Hammer was undoubtedly used for a wide variety of illicit intelligence operations, but mainly it was used to finance a covert economic operation against the collapsing Soviet Union, whereby unknown Western investors bought up much of the Soviet industry with a focus on oil and gas, crashing the Russian economy, looting its central bank, orchestrating what became known as the Great Ruble Scam, and a wide variety of other clandestine, state-assisted operations designed to thoroughly prevent Russia from ever contesting the U.S. as a world superpower, while in the process lining the pockets of these economic hitmen who swooped in to devour the collapsing Russian economy after the fall of the Soviet Union. A spectacular investment for all, at least until money laundering investigations began tracing all the money, or when the 10-year deadline came up and the securities became due and began the routine process of authenticity and ownership checks. Evidence shows that several federal and private investigations had already stumbled upon the Hammer Fund and were compiling evidence on it up until the 9/11 attacks. These included the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, which was moved to the outer E-ring of the recently renovated section of the Pentagon that was targeted and destroyed on 9/11. According to E.P. Heidner, the ONI had been investigating crimes associated with the plundering of Russia. 39 out of the 40 people who worked in those offices were killed on 9/11, including the entire chain of command. The Pentagon's financial accounting offices in that same wing were also an obvious target, as were the passengers on board Flight 77, many of whom coincidentally held top-secret clearances and were connected with Pentagon black operations. Agents of the Office of Naval Intelligence had also been investigating financial transactions which were linked to securities being managed by those securities dealers in the World Trade Center that were also targeted.
Hey, by the way, I'll just pause it. Do you want me to keep playing it? Because then he just talks about Cantor, he talks about Euro brokers, he talks about the treasuries, and he talks about them being taken out. Or do you want to just jump in?
I want to say one thing about this. This is the Black Eagle Trust Fund, I think it's called, and this trust that they created with this $200 billion. And it's interesting that this has an Israeli connection as well. One of the people involved in this was a young man from the Seattle, Washington area. I don't have his name at my fingertips, but he was involved. He was working in Israel at an embassy guard or something like that, and he got involved with this Israeli girl, and then was living on a moshav. And in a moshav in Israel, in shortly after 1991 or in sometime in this period, he's involved in this Black Eagle Trust Fund. He carried out a transaction from a computer there for something like $120 billion, and he's tied into this whole thing. And when I went out to Camino Island and that area, Stanwood, Washington, where this young man is from, I interviewed his father. This was a couple years ago, to find out what his father knew about this, and the son was now back out of Israel, living in Los Angeles, but the father appeared or acted as if he knew nothing about this big financial scandal or scam that his son was involved in. But as you say, you see, these huge crimes, these huge frauds, like Enron, like the Black Eagle Trust Fund, like WorldCom, the evidence of these huge crimes was being stored in the basement of Building 6. And Building 6, the vault of Building 6 was cleaned out the night before 9/11 happened.
Right.
Somebody went in there, blew open the vault door, and cleaned out the vault. We know this from the videographer, Kurt Sonnenfeld, who went down there with his video camera for FEMA and filmed it. And he's now hiding, or he's in exile in Argentina. So the evidence, the destruction of evidence, as you say, is absolutely a very big part of the crime. 9/11 is such a huge crime that it's like one of those Russian dolls. It's a crime within a crime within a crime. And, that's why it would take, of course, a very long time to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. And there was gold that was also being looted from below building number 4. And we know that that's on the record because they found the truck that was trying to flee, and there was a brace of one of the buildings that collapsed. The truck got stuck, and the driver had to flee before those buildings came down, and it was still loaded with gold. So you're right. It's a crime within a crime within a crime. And also I'd like to note that in Building 6 was the El Dorado Task Force's offices of interagency money laundering, the watchdog group tasked with money laundering investigations. And after 9/11, they were redirected to investigate terrorist financing. So this whole thing conveniently erased the $240 billion worth of Treasury fraud. And again, one of these things where it's like the media says it's Occam's razor. These conspiracy theories are far too convoluted and complex to hold water. Obviously, what really happened was the official story is true. It was Osama bin Laden directing some guys from a cave in Afghanistan. Now, when you get down to these details, you just can't make up the coincidences. Like 41% of the fatalities in the Twin Towers came from just 2 companies that managed U.S. government securities, Cantor Fitzgerald and Euro brokers. And conveniently, Flight 11 flew into the secure computer room just below the floor of Cantor Fitzgerald. Whose computer room was it? Martian McLennan. I mean, just can't make this stuff up. So if you don't mind, I want to play one more clip from Alien Scientist, and it kind of sums up all of this fraud as it relates to the financial crime of 9/11.
Okay, so what does all this mean? Overall, a critical mass of brokers from the major government security brokerages in the Twin Towers had to be eliminated to create chaos in the government securities market. A situation needed to be created wherein $240 billion of covert securities could be electronically cleared without anyone asking questions, which happened when the Federal Reserve declared an emergency and invoked its emergency powers that very afternoon. On September 14th, the Securities and Exchange Commission declared a national emergency and for the first time in U.S. history invoked its emergency powers under the Securities Exchange Act Section 12K and eased regulatory restrictions for clearing and settling security trades for the next 15 days. These changes would have allowed the estimated $240 billion in covert government securities to be cleared upon maturity without the standard regulatory controls around identification of ownership. The towers needed to be demolished to create a big enough mess that the illicit activities taking place behind the scenes that morning could be hidden in the confusion of that day.
Well, they did a heck of a job covering up so many crimes with the event of 9/11. And just a couple more things I want to say. You'll recall that it was Donald Rumsfeld the day before 9/11 who said the Pentagon can't account for $2.1 trillion. It should be noted that the comptroller of the Pentagon at this time in history was Dov Zakheim, another dual citizen of Israel. So when the media says we're just nutty conspiracy theorists, the media clearly is covering up for the real criminals. And everybody who is a truther knows that. Yeah, and the thing is that, my Solving 9/11 book took me a long time to write. I started writing it in 2001, but it only came out in 2012. And in this, I look at the matrix of criminals. Now, the people who are involved in the crime at every level, and then the people who are involved in the cover-up, because the cover-up is, like Mr. Nixon said, President Nixon said, that's where they get you, is on the cover-up. And because the people that are involved in the cover-up are clearly seen. We know who they are, like Michael Chertoff, the guy who did not investigate 9/11, the one who allowed the evidence to be destroyed. How did they handle this in the media? The media pretended they didn't understand who was behind the destruction of evidence. They never quite put their finger on it for the first year or so. Why is the evidence being destroyed? Where is it going? Who's in charge of this? Well, it was obviously Chertoff. But they were very good at keeping his role, protected, concealed in a way. And he's the one who authorized the destruction of the evidence. And where I work on this whole 9/11 problem is I approach it as a crime that was not investigated and has not been solved. I've given my best effort to solve it, but we have to understand that 9/11 was never investigated as a crime. And so it's that, and they tried to blame the military, and they tried to blame the CIA and the FBI for failing to understand the whole problem. This is another setup. By putting the blame on them, by showing them to be rather inept or incompetent in seeing the danger or preventing what happened, it brought about the complete restructuring of the American intelligence community, the U.S. military and intelligence community. They were reformatted after 9/11. You said something very important, and you're 100% right. I think it was even Bush himself who said, no one could have imagined terrorists flying 2 planes into buildings. But of course, then I think it was Rupert's investigation, or one of the investigators, who then showed us that, no, there were drills. There was a Pentagon operation in which they imagined a plane. I guess you'd call it an exercise. There was an exercise in which they modeled what would happen if an airliner hit the Pentagon. So it's just cover up after cover up. And, I want to ask you about the role of Larry Silverstein and his magical 100-year lease that he signed on the WTC properties 3 months prior to the event and had them double insured against terrorist acts. But let me ask you this first. In the news now, of course, very timely, we have former Mayor Rudy Giuliani joining the Trump team. And many of us hold out hope that Trump is going to put an end to child sex trafficking. He's certainly made the issue of human trafficking something that he's talked about publicly, as has Steve Scalise, who then was shot by a would-be assassin. We have hopes that this president will give us the reprieve needed to take our country back. But I don't want to be too naive. What I've said, Christopher, is that this guy is a whole lot better than the Rothschild puppet and witch, Hillary Clinton, who literally would have fast-tracked all of these things, including taking our guns, destroying the Second Amendment, opening the borders. It would have been game over. So I do believe we've been given a reprieve under Trump. But let's just talk about the elephant in the room. Rudy Giuliani, who I believe on 9/11 was just a very low-level foot soldier. Do you think he has any culpability at all in this cover-up, or was he just scared to death and he knew he couldn't speak out, or they just whack him? No. Like I said, you have to understand that 9/11 was a very sophisticated military operation that had been planned and prepared over decades. In my little book, The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East, I show that 9/11 didn't happen out of a clear blue sky on its own. 9/11 was actually done in order to create or to kickstart the War on Terror. The War on Terror is an older construct. The War on Terror was rolled out onto the propaganda stage in 1979 in Israel at the Netanyahu Institute with Menachem Begin and Bibi Netanyahu, leading the show. And what they basically were calling for, and Netanyahu wrote several books about the subject afterwards in the 80s, they were calling for the United States to lead
the Western democracies militarily into the Middle East to basically vanquish the terrorist threat to Israel and to destroy those nations that harbored these terrorist groups. And this is where the whole 7 countries in 5-year memo comes from. The idea that the United States after 9/11 should go in and take out Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, et cetera, ending with Iran. And all those countries have been done. Lebanon is still kind of like unaffected yet, but it's been terribly fractionalized over a period of years. And Iran is the last country in the game. This is the agenda. This is what 9/11 was done to create. This is what we got. I don't know about peak oil. I don't know how much what these theories have led to, but the Israeli Yinon plan, and this is to conquer the Middle East and to dominate the region by breaking up the Arab countries into little ethnic statelets, like what was done to Yugoslavia, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, Syria. They're trying to break up Syria right now. This is the game plan. This is what's been going on for 16 years. This is what the American taxpayers' money has been spent on and borrowed on our credit, $600 billion a year for this. And Donald Trump was right when he said the other day, we've spent $7 trillion with a T, $7 trillion in 17 years. And what did we get? Nothing. We got worse than nothing. We lost a lot of American people, a lot of young lives, and we've killed over 1 million people. So it's been carnage for nothing.
I couldn't agree more. And, we have that clip of Hillary Clinton gloating about the fact that
we came, we saw, he died.
She's largely responsible for having killed Gaddafi. And, these people have so much blood on their hands. All right, well, I'm glad I asked you that about Rudy Giuliani because it ties into Silverstein Properties. It ties into World Trade Center 7, which, as you know, was World Trade Center 7 housed the New York mayor's command and control bunker, a reinforced bunker for the mayor to go to in times of a city emergency. And, of course, we have this footage of him running through the street, followed by reporters.
All that we know right now is that 2 airplanes struck the 2 large towers of the World Trade Center. We spoke to the White House. There also apparently was an attack on the Pentagon. We asked that the airspace around the city of New York be sealed by military aircraft. We've been informed that it has been, and we've seen military aircraft up in the air. So we're hopeful that right now things are secure.
He and everybody in World Trade Center 7 were cleared out hours and hours and hours before what happened to World Trade Center 7 at 5:25 in the afternoon, at which time it fell at free fall speed. And, of course, we have the BBC, I believe it was the BBC, reporting about the collapse of that building, the Solomon building, 20 minutes before it actually collapsed. So they cleared everybody out. Giuliani evidently didn't know why. And something went wrong as it relates to WTC 7, because I can't believe they wanted that building to fall at free fall speed for the world to see at 5:25 in the afternoon. What do you make of World Trade Center 7? It's really a smoking gun.
Well, you're right about the OEM, the Office of Emergency Management for New York City, on the 23rd floor. But I'm pretty sure that they had relocated the day before. So on September 11th, they were down at Pier 23, I think it was.
Yeah.
Because they were preparing.
FEMA was there. That's right.
Yeah, they were preparing for one of these FEMA drills where Dick Cheney would have been involved, and this is this mass disaster. But not a military thing. This is not the military planes flying in from Russia or anything like that. These drills, there were many of those drills going on, 3 or 4 of those, Vigilant Guardian, Northern Guardian, what have you. This was a New York City drill of some sort of nerve gas or biochemical weapon, and then how they would handle such a situation. And so because of that upcoming scenario plan, drill exercise, they had relocated the OEM down to the 23rd Pier 23, which meant that the OEM, the 23rd floor of building number 7, was occupied by somebody else that morning. And it seems to me that the people that pulled the plug, that pulled the buildings, that oversaw the demolition of the towers, did so from those buildings. And you remember, I think it was Barry Jennings, I think his name is, a black man,
right,
who talked about coming out of Building 7 in the morning, and he said there had been explosions in there. There were bodies in the hallways and in the lobby. So, and this is early on.
Well, me and Mr. Hesh, the corporation counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. And I turned to Hesh. I said, this is it. We're dead. We're not going to make it out of here.
So, something very, and some of these guys actually got trapped in Building 7 for a little while and had to be rescued by the fire department. But something very strange was going on in Building 7, and they had to destroy Building 7, I think, because they had to destroy the evidence.
Yeah. No, I think you're 100% right. I just don't think they wanted that building to come down in the late afternoon. I think it was probably meant to come down on around the time that the Twin Towers came down. It makes you wonder about that that other plane that went down in a field in
Shanksville, Lambertsville, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see, the thing is that that's what I mean, is that there's so many things, there's so many loose ends. All you have to do, first of all, you have to understand we've been deceived about what happened on 9/11 by our government and our media for 16 and a half years now. But you and I are both on the same page on this. But millions of Americans still believe the official story. Many Americans, old, young, rich, poor, they believe the official government story about 9/11 to this day. So they have not come to the understanding that we've been lied to about 9/11. So in this day and age now, where we are right now, I try to make it very simple to explain to people how you can talk to people and let them understand that we're being lied to, and give them the most simple, basic facts that show that we've been lied to about 9/11, and we were lied to for one reason. We were lied to protect the guilty, obviously, and also to take this nation into a war that we are still in. I mean, this war is taking the food off of our table, literally and figuratively. The American people are suffering greatly, economically, spiritually, morally, because of the war that we've been deceived into fighting. So I say 9/11 truth is the peace movement, because when you understand 9/11 truth, you'll understand that the war is a complete fraud and needs to stop.
Amen. 100% true. And I don't want to beat this thing to death, but as we round out the conversation, I do want to focus on, World Trade Center 7 and the entire World Trade Center complex and Larry Silverstein. And I just want to remind people that, first of all, what you just said about the OEM in World Trade Center 7 kind of blows my mind. I'd never thought of that fact, that Giuliani may not have been there at all, and that somebody else was running the operation out of that building. By the way, World Trade Center 7 also housed an office of the CIA, I believe one of the bigger offices of the SEC. I've heard some of the records for, I believe, WorldCom and Enron, and those investigations were stored in World Trade Center 7. So again, you pull the plug on World Trade Center 7 and a lot of those problems go away. All right, I want to ask you about Larry Silverstein. He signed a 100-year lease 3 months prior, and then had the prescience to get the buildings insured for, I think, double indemnity against, or at least he tried to recover that, against an act of terrorism. Again, just a crazy coincidence, right?
Yeah, and the clause that was about the terrorist attacks was used in his insurance contract, was used for the first time ever. And very briefly, I want to tell you, Larry Silverstein is a kind of a gangster type character. He had a strip club called Runway 69 in I think it's in the Bronx by the airport. And he did not have the wherewithal. He did not have the money to buy the World Trade Center, to lease the World Trade Center, even to put down the down payment. It was beyond him. So the money that put down the down payment, which was a very small fraction of the amount, came from a company, GMAC, General Motors financial company, that went bankrupt in 2008. Another Zionist guy owned that and fronted the money up, gave Larry Silverstein the money. Now, how Larry Silverstein got the building, very briefly, is that there's Governor Pataki was going to privatize some properties in the state. He set up a privatization board. The privatization board for New York State was headed by a guy named Ronald Lauder, the son of Estee Lauder, the cosmetic queen. He's a very big Israeli first guy. He has a Lauder School of Government and Strategy in Israel at the university, which is, I call Mossad University in Herzliya. It's called the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. And there at the IDC, the head general who's in charge of strategy and policy is a Rothschild. His name is Danny Rothschild. And these two guys worked together in Israel, Ronald Lauder and Danny Rothschild. Well, Ronald Lauder was in charge of privatizing the properties of New York. He chose to privatize the World Trade Center. Then it went to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey to negotiate. They had a couple of people who wanted to buy it. They made it very difficult for the one company, Vornado, who was the expected buyer, and it suddenly went to Larry Silverstein. Now, the person who ran the negotiations for the Port Authority was a man named Louis Eisenberg. He and Larry Silverstein are both on the board of directors of an organization called the United Jewish Appeal, Jewish Federation of New York City. So they have this charitable. This is the largest organization for funding the state of Israel in the world, and this is where they get a lot of money from New York Jews and Zionists to support Israel. These two men were on the board of directors of that organization, so that was the back channel that made sure that Larry Silverstein got the contract, got the lease, and he got the lease. I think it was July 26th, about 5 weeks before 9/11 happened. And not only did he insure all the profits and whatnot, he also insured the rents. And the first thing that he did when he took over the property, he increased the rents 40%. 40%. So by then insuring his future rents, he also increased that 40%. I mean, this is complete gangsterism. And it's a shame that our country and our people have not found a way to bring these people to justice after 16 years. It really does not say a lot for our system of justice.
You're blowing my mind. I didn't know much of that about Silverstein and who he was in bed with to get the money for the down payment, but it stands to reason because, correct me if I'm wrong, but my takeaway from what you're saying is none of these people were Muslims. No,
of course not. None of them were Muslims. And that's why I like what Louis Farrakhan said. I just saw a little thing he said. It's in an interview that I did with Adam Green in Laguna Beach last year, and it's been seen by a lot of people. And he has a little clip in there where the Reverend or Minister Farrakhan says exactly that. He's speaking to his audience, his American Nation of Islam people, and he's saying that Osama bin Laden didn't have this sophistication to do this, and of course he didn't. Whoever carried out 9/11, they tricked the U.S. military. They tricked the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. They tricked the Secret Service. They tricked the government. They tricked everybody. This is a massive deception. That's why I call my book The Deception That Changed the World, because you have to understand that 9/11 was carried out on deception. It's all like a stage magician's trick, Look here, you see this, you don't see that. So, nothing is as it seems. It is as it seems.
You sparked another thought. You say this whole thing was a trick. They even tricked the United States, the U.S. military. I think they also had cohorts in control, probably at the Pentagon at some level. But it reminds me of Carl Cameron's Fox News 4-part series about Israeli spies in the United States. This Israeli spying was absolutely rampant. Carl Cameron, the only truth teller at that point, telling the story to the American people, anyone who would listen, about Israeli spies active around all of these areas on 9/11, before 9/11, in the couple years prior to 9/11. And I would remind people to watch the video I made called 9/11 from Cheney to Mossad if you want to hear about the Israeli art students who were in the World Trade Center towers doing a quote-unquote art project called the Bee Thing a full year before 9/11. Again, they weren't Muslims. They were Israeli art students, probably some of which were probably Mossad spies.
Yeah. Gelatin Bee Project. It was, they weren't all Israeli. There were. I don't know if any of them were Israelis, but
there's some Austrians in the mix too.
Yeah, Austrian. What I think that was was meant to be a distraction from the Israelis who were the art students who were spying on the DEA.
Right.
There were like 200 of them in Florida living around these ones who were spying on the DEA. There's 200 or so for the 2 years before 9/11. They were living in very close proximity to Mohammed Atta and all these guys, right? So what you have is an Israeli Mossad or intelligence operation which is really beyond the ken of most Americans to imagine. So that's why I recommend that people read a book called The Little Drummer Girl by John le Carré. That's one of his books written in 1982, where he shows how the Israelis lay a false trail for a Palestinian guy who then gets, a bomb goes off in a synagogue in Germany, and the next day this guy's found dead on the Autobahn, and it's, of course, the Palestinian is blamed. But to see how they leave a false trail, see how they lay these tracks, they lay behind these false tracks, which are then picked up by the investigators and say, ha 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 ha! Look what we found here! Ah, an Arab! That's how we've been played. We've been played like a cheap fiddle, and it's to understand how it's done, because really Americans are not that deceptive. We're not skilled in the art of deception. We're really tend to be quite honest and open people. So we're easily played by people who are a little bit more clever than we are and use tricks to trick us. And we need to come up to speed to understand how we've been tricked. That's what we need to understand. And when we understand we've been tricked, that's the beginning of the cure. But as long as people are deceived, as long as half or more than half the population in the United States is woefully deceived about 9/11 and the war on terror, we don't have much of a chance. We have to increase awareness. More people have to understand how we've been cheated and why we've been cheated.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and these people are very Machiavellian, and it's hard for the average person, you're right, who's correctly wired, who would never dream of killing another person or killing a bunch of people in order to profit. It's hard for any of us who are wired normally to imagine a crime of this magnitude. But again, this type of research is only being done by the alternative investigative journalists out there like Christopher Bollyn, probably the leading researcher in this space. Christopher, before we let you go, I want everybody to know, I'll put the link below so that folks can go and support you and buy your book, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. Guys, that'll be right below this video in the more information section. I will also post that alien scientist video. It's an absolute must-watch, 45 minutes. And is there anything else I missed? It's such a huge topic. We can certainly keep going if I missed anything. But anything else before we go?
No, I think you've done a good job, but I would point out that the little book, the new book called The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule Middle East, that might be a good place to start for some people, because that puts our situation today into the context of what 9/11 was all about and how we've been tricked into this war. Because we need to we need to stop the war. We need to change gears and restore integrity to our nation. Understanding the details of 9/11, that's you can find in my book, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World.
Okay, well, very good, and I'll make sure that link is included as well. In fact, I'll probably provide a link so people can buy all three of your books for the $50. I think that's a great deal. Guys, visit Bollyn.com. That's spelled Bollyn. Our guest has been Christopher Bollyn. I so appreciate your research, and I appreciate your time. Christopher, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely my pleasure. And my thanks to Adam Green for getting us in touch with each other. And guys, thank you so much for listening. For Real News 24/7, the antidote to corporate propaganda and outright lies, visit us at SGT Report. Also check out thephaser.com and my site, thelibertymill.com. God bless. Bye-bye.
Your future is at stake. Your life depends on stopping this coup. Every American. What the deep state is doing is a life and death matter.